So there's an expression in Hebrew, I don't know, it's Gomrim Ulchim. I don't know how to translate it to English. It's from the Hebrew military. You know, we get a job done, we get to go home. So we might as well start. Okay, so we as I wrote in the email that maybe some of you got, so this panel started like the idea for this panel, in fact, should have been there from the start, but you know, as disorganized as we are, we kind of started like maybe last week, trying to see how we're going to get an opening talk to this workshop. Somebody going to give some overview of the field, and then we asked Amal, can you do it in the last minute? And she said, first she said, yes, great, yeah, I'll do it. And then a couple of days later, maybe, you know, and then we started having this discussion by email, you know, what are the topics and stuff, and then we realized, okay, in fact, this is a discussion that everybody should be part of, and said, okay, why don't we make it a panel? And then we started, you know, when we're going to make the panel, so let's do it in the end. And we kind of thought that we'll be maybe the only ones left in the end, but there are still a couple brave ones left, so that's great. So essentially, so it's the four of us giving our like, we'll start maybe with just brief ideas of what we have in mind, the things that we thought of, and then we'll just open it up for discussion. I think it should be like an interactive thing. So here's kind of like 2.5 slides about kind of high-level stuff of where we are. My kind of personal and biased and not objective view of where we are. So in essence, cryptographic program analysis, or protocol analysis, is a special case of programming language analysis, in the sense that we are trying to prove properties of programs or protocols, which are distributed programs, and we want to do static analysis, right? We want to look at code and see what the code does, and make statements about what the code does. So of course, it doesn't need to be just code, it can be also hardware and other parts of computing elements, but essentially programs, right? And in particular, what you want to do is to prove correctness properties, liveness properties, and some sort of information flow properties, in sense of like how informations flow through the programs and the computation, you know, where it does go, where it doesn't go, and different type of things. Things like that. But it is a very specific special case, right? So the properties are inherently probabilistic. Even to talk about privacy, secrecy in the Shannon sense, you have to talk about randomness. And the solutions are inherently randomized as a consequence. So this, you know, so we have to be able to talk about probabilities in programs. And the systems are distributed, and we typically want to talk about adversarially controlled scheduling and control of the distributed system, and in certain forms of, you know, more or less limited, restricted. That means that already here, the modeling becomes very delicate, and we need to make the right probabilistic statements, how to make it, and this is already by itself, it's a very delicate issue. And then on top of it, most of the properties we can prove on non-normal protocols are only for potentially bounded adversaries, and furthermore, we can only do it by reduction to other you know, hard problems. So it makes the modeling much more delicate, and the proofs are pretty stylized, because essentially this is what we know how to do. And on top of everything, kind of disappears everywhere, but the security preserving composition is really tricky. I mean, you really want to have a security of a big system, you want to do it in a modular way, or in any way that you want to do it, to be able to deduce about security of bigger systems. Small one is tricky. But this is the special case we're talking about. And so just, again, a biased brief history of time. So if you think about the crypto world, how the notions of security kind of evolved from the 80s. So we started with the notion of semantic security, so randomness, kind of like the very basics of how we can actually mathematically talk about security. Then we had those simple, the initial game-based definitions. Then we had the simulation paradigm that evolved. And then kind of like slightly separated simulation-based from real ideal because, well, they're kind of tied together, but not completely. So we have the real ideal paradigm in the context of MPC or more generally in crypto protocols. And then talk about composition, particularly universal composition, which kind of this general way of talking about composition. Then we can have more modern style definitions, like a game-based definitions with simulations, which are, in some sense, you can think of them as variants of UC definitions for specific settings. You know, joint state compositions, things that are more delicate, but this is where we are in crypto modeling. And in the kind of this PL-based security modeling. So there's, of course, a lot of work done on modeling concurrency and this notion of refinement, which actually is a very, maybe Amal will say more about it, but it is in some sense kind of like the moral equivalence of universal composition, you know, taking a module and replacing with another module having the same effect. And then there were a lot of work was done on PL-based modeling of security. So maybe the first most famous one is the Leviar model, where all the cryptographic components are kind of ideal boxes, and you can proof stuff on them, and then what does it mean in real life? And then there is a modeling, again, of concurrency with the pi calculus, and by simulation, which is again kind of a moral equivalent of emulation with some caveats. Then we have the SPI calculus, which is doing right again about security properties. And then the people started combining those two worlds, by the Rogoway showing like computationally sound ideal cryptography, and then Michancho-Worinsky and other works that built on that. But in those works, still there was this separate worlds. There was a computational world, and there was a divide, and then you kind of realize an ideal world, and the rest of the analysis is ideal. And then we advanced further, and we started having those programming languages style analysis of proofs by reduction, the actual cryptographic proofs that, you know, cryptographers do every day. And start with game-based proof, which is kind of an easier thing to model. We have CryptoVerif, we have EasyCrypt, we have FCF, we have other systems today. And then our next step was to kind of start doing the same thing, but not for game-based definitions, but simulation-based definitions with simulator, ideal, and real model, and UC proof. You've seen the talk of Ali yesterday. And things seems to be kind of like coming together in a good way, I think. And let me try to be audacious, but say maybe, you know, UC security and PL staff proof, maybe it's a match made in heaven in the sense that this is a way to get the best of everything. So you can have, so since even mechanized proofs have problem with the scale, right? So you want to do it modularly even with mechanized proofs. So this way you can maybe get it all. You get meaningful and expressive properties with cryptographic soundness and PL soundness, no bugs in proofs and implementation. And we can have different layers of analysis kind of talk together, hopefully one day. So all the way down from the design to the protocol, to the primitives, to the implementation of the primitives, to the hardware, deployments, and everything, you know, and all those analyses talk to each other, and do it for real style, you know, production style protocols. So that's hopefully the goal. Anyway, so that's was my spiel. So I think Amal has some. So we can ask me about this, or you can do your talk, and I know which order you want to do.
I was going to say that second last point right there, different layers. That's one of the things that I was hoping to talk about. That's one of the things I was hoping we could talk about, and I could give you a little bit of a sense of how we think about compiler correctness and compiler verification and security preserving compilation in the PL setting, and then perhaps try to ask you, like, you know, from crypto perspective, if we talk about different layers of analysis and sort of getting end-to-end proofs of an entire software stack, what does that look like? What are the properties we're interested in verifying? Like, that's one topic of discussion that I was hoping that we could have. So up to you. Should we?
Okay. So
let's let Amal present her slides, and then we can all sit down in front and sort of go back and forth.
Sure. Okay.
Possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
yeah.
also, we'd really like to make this a conversation, not just us talking, because the point is, we want to know what people's thoughts are about all of these topics. So if anyone wants to say something right now pertaining to that, that's, yeah, Muthu.
I just have like a very brief question. Just for what I would consider the simplest protocol in the passive setting is like BGW, let's say, three-party BGW. Has there been any analysis for this, like in the formal space that we know of? Right. I mean, no probabilities, nothing. Perfectly secure BGW passive, like one should not even worry about probabilities in this case. Has there been something done in the formal regime to?
Well,
What do you want?
BGW is a probabilistic protocol, right? But
Perhaps
okay.
perfect security. Maybe it's possible to factor that out. I don't
So,
know.
so I think what you were talking about earlier today, sounded like something along these lines, right?
What was your question? Sorry.
I don't want to think about probabilities indistinguishability for all adversaries yet. Like when I think of perfect security, passive setting, formal proofs must be much more simpler. Hopefully, I don't know, as a starting point.
But you still reason about like output distributions and not.
Perfectly secure, then again, the distributions are identical. So would it become easier? Like, shouldn't a formal proof be much more easier than arguing indistinguishability against polynomial time adversaries or even exponential? I don't want to think about that, but just argue perfect security.
It's just a different kind of argument. I mean, you still argue about distributions. You don't have to do security reduction. So in that sense, it gets easier. Yeah.
Even a one-time pad requires a way of working with the random choice that uses an isomorphism on the space of bit strings, say. So I think it's the case that a purely symbolic checker like the Stolov-Yao system isn't going to be able to handle that.
By simulation might
I'm not sure that it would, but a tool like EasyCrypt or CryptoVerif or FCF has a way of dealing with this kind of thing. That even with information theoretic security, I think we need something more than just symbolic.
Okay, since we're already talking about this topic, I thought I'd just race ahead because I had it last in my slide deck. But yeah, so the question is, there are, these various tools for verifying, for doing machine check proofs of crypto protocols, and, what's sort of missing in this space. And beyond that, then there's this sort of other issue of beyond verifying protocols, what are the problems that need to be solved to get an end-to-end security guarantee about implementations of protocols? So this is along the lines of what Manuel was talking about in his talk yesterday. Are there gaps? Are there things that we take for granted that are problems that we should be addressing? So, is Manuel here?
He had to go.
He had to go. Oh, that's a shame.
Can I just say something about gaps while we're on that subject? That there's a way of thinking, like in the deep spec community and in the programming language area, that everything needs to be within a single proof assistant. So there's this common currency. And the problem is that we have some specialized tools that are good for different kinds of things. And so EasyCrypt is good for doing these relational proofs, computational model proofs, but Coq is good for doing proofs about compilation, refinement from some high-level specification, eventually to machine code. And there's this question, how do you put them together? And I think we don't, there is work in the PL and logic community about this topic. It's not something I know a lot about, but we need to somehow crack it, because it's not okay, I think, to say everything has to be done in a single system. I think that's limiting. It's also frustrating to do the kind of thing that Manuel and his colleagues have done in these works, where they do a proof at one level and then they do a proof at another level and then they hand wave about the glue between the two. And I mean, it's not wrong, but it's potentially, it could be wrong. It could be that the assumptions are somehow inconsistent, that this gap, I mean, there's some papers, mind the gap, and the gap is potentially something you can get your foot stuck in as you're trying to get onto the train.
So let's talk precisely about what these gaps are, right? So there are proofs at different levels. When you say levels, you mean different, like in the sense of a compiler, as we're translating down to a lower level in Manuel's work, for instance. So that kind of thing is something that, the PL community has been working on compiler verification, compiler correctness for a while. How do we start to think about, going from a proof of a protocol verified at, just at the level of this is my protocol and I need to specify it somehow, to now implementing that protocol in something like EasyCrypt using EasyCrypt's WILE language, right? And then going from that very simple implementation to actually, how do I actually turn this implementation of a protocol into the actual code for the protocol that runs at the end of the day on the machine, right? How do I take the proof of perhaps UC or for this protocol and preserve it all the way down through different stages of the compiler? And something interesting that comes up if we start to ask this question, or at least I've been asking it to various people over the last, since yesterday, is what happens to our attacker model? So if we go back to UC, right, you have this idea of there's an ideal functionality, there is a real implementation in some sense for that functionality. And we want to prove that for all possible adversaries, there's a simulator that such that the environment can't tell the difference between ideal interacting with the simulator and the real interacting with the adversary, right? So now, how do we, to me, as a PL person, this is an equivalence proof. It is an equivalence between the real and the ideal, all right? And I think most of the people in this room are crypto people. I have a slide on how PL people think about equivalence proofs in a single language, just the statement. Would you like to see that? Yes? Okay, great. Let me go back. We have a few different, so this was my question, yes. Relationship between UC and contextual equivalence in PL. Okay, so in PL, if you have a single language, single programming language, then, and imagine that E1 and E2 are expressions, any program expressions that I can write in that language, but these are not whole programs. Think of them as program components. Then we say that E1 and E2 are equivalent, contextually equivalent is the term used for it, if they exhibit the same behavior, observable behavior when placed in any legitimate program context. So there's always this idea of, there is a context, this gray oval over here. That is what I need. That's the rest of the program, such that when I have it, I will have a complete program that I can run. And then you basically say that for all possible contexts, which is that gray oval, if I stick E1 into that hole in my context and run it, then I should see the same observable behavior as if I stick E2 into that context. This is the standard notion of contextual equivalence that's been around for.
What is observable?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and my slide oversimplifies this. So here I wrote it as if you run E1 with in the context, then you get a value V. Then you get the same value V as if you run the whole program with E2 and stuck in that hole. So an observable can be different things depending on your language. And in a language in which all programs terminate, you say, when I run the program, I will get the same answer, the same value out at the end, and usually we restrict it so that we say integer values or some kind of value that we can actually test equality on, so not functions, for instance. If it's some sort of a language in which you produce observable traces, like you're printing to the screen or to a file or modifying memory, then your observables, modifying memory sometimes is not taken as externally observable, but sometimes you could. But so there's some room here in what is observable behavior. You have to sort of decide that a priori, and then the definition basically says you say the same observable behavior when you run that program as when you run that program. So literally, it could be I/O.
In like process. So in process algebra and sort of, it can be something much more complicated. So it could be the observable behavior of a whole system could be something that's very complicated, or it could be something that's very simple.
Yes.
In crypto, typically the guarantees are probabilistic. So what if this gray program, I mean, this is how I define security definitions when I teach crypto. I say that for any gray program, it will have the same output distribution, whether it's got E1 or E2 inside of this hole.
Exactly.
So
that's
is that
exactly
typical
how.
thing?
In fact, that's exactly how I would take that notion of observable for this setting, for the probabilistic setting, and change it to distributions. That you want to see the same distribution when you run the first program as when you see the second.
What are the interactions?
Now that is a huge point. So in PL, in PL there are different. This property contextual equivalence is very difficult to prove in PL in general. It's very easy to prove in the following simple setting. When the interactions between the gray part and the whole are simply a matter of passing things like integers and strings across that boundary, then this is, contextual equivalence properties can be quite easy to reason about. But often, for like high-level languages, we think about computations flowing across, or at least pointers to computations, to code flowing across, right? So you might have the gray part pass a function to my E1 and let it run it. Then it gets more difficult because then you have to reason about, you effectively have to say the gray part is passing some sort of computation into the E1 and how will it use it? So then you get into this issue of what makes functions equivalent. And functions are equivalent if given related inputs, they give you related outputs. So it's a harder problem. And that is actually another thing for crypto. So if you think about UC, and if you think about interactions between the real and the adversary, it seems to me, I mean, they're sort of at the level of base types, right? They're at the level of integers. In that sense, it's a simpler setting, right? You're not passing computations between that interaction, if I'm right.
That's correct.
Yeah.
You could. I mean, those strings can be anything.
They can be anything, okay. So then that's a fundamental question for me, at least. As a community, given this problem, let's say we wanted to do something like UC preserving compilation, whatever that is, however we define it. Should we worry about computations flowing across that?
Yeah,
We should.
I think because in crypto we want
Yes.
they can do.
Yeah.
So in particular, but actually, so other questions. So is there any discussion in the compiler language about making conditional statements, putting because, for instance, in
yes.
crypto we would say it only for potentially bounded guys, for instance, or maybe other restrictions.
So yeah, in compiler verification in general, it's never about computationally bounded. That's the part of the gap, right? It's always about, but there are techniques for limiting what your context can do. So you can say, for instance, I will only link with well-typed contexts. And by being well-typed, you're ruling out certain classes of bad behavior. So that means you're linking with attackers which are better behaved, in a sense, and you can use these types or specifications to say, I will only link with something that satisfies this spec, and somehow you want to tighten that spec enough so that the attacker doesn't behave badly. That's the trick. Sabine, you had I have a couple more on what's going on with this idea of equivalence when it comes to not just a single language, but compiling, all right, which I think is pertinent to this discussion. So, yeah.
So I assume part of program equivalence is that you can then choose which of these items to use, right? As a compiler.
Yeah. So I haven't. So here, think of this as For now, I'm showing you a single language definition, right? So usually when we think about this single language contextual equivalence, we're saying, let's say you had a stack interface and you had two different implementations, E1 and E2. One uses, represents the stack as a linked list, the other one represents the stack as an array. This is the kind of thing I would use to prove to someone that, oh, I can just swap out one implementation with the other and the rest of the world, all the clients will not know the difference.
So, but if I have an optimizing compiler, I could be
Yes.
like, oh, the right thing to use is E1 for this setting.
Yes.
And so you not only need to argue about equivalence, you need to understand like resource utilization
Ah.
of these two.
So in the compiler correctness community, we are not very far along in terms of showing that that E1 is somehow more optimal than E2. There are some techniques for doing that. They obviously require accounting for cost and so on. But yeah, there are languages and type systems for doing that. People haven't started talking about them in a compilation context yet. Yeah. So actually, I'd like to show you just a couple more slides because the ones that come up now are about compilation, whereas the first one was really in my mind about the source language itself. Okay, so I want to sort of categorize what's happening in the compiler verification world. So the simplest possible thing that even that is not simple, that people have proved in compiler verification is compiler correctness under the assumption that when you have a source program PS and you compile it to a target program PT, I'm going to assume that that PT never gets linked with any other target code. Okay? Under that assumption, I can prove to you that PS and PT are equivalent. And what does it mean for them to be equivalent? Roughly, it means that if you run PS and you see some observable behaviors, then if you run PT, you will see the same observable behaviors. This is the way that, this is the kind of compiler correctness proof, this is whole program semantics preservation, that the CompSearch-C compiler proved until very, very recently when it's been...
So you need to defend it by, I guess,
Yes.
obviously it's different programs, right?
They do very different things. And the whole trick here then becomes, essentially how this proof is set up is you say, okay, I have the source program and I'm running it, right? I want to show that that somehow simulates the behavior of the target program running. So the way the proof is done is you say, well, first let me say observables. Observables could be, external function calls or input-output. So genuinely, I/O kinds of behavior that you can observe from the outside. And then the way you do the proof is you actually come up with a relation between source and target. So for example, if I have 5 in the source, I might want to relate it to 101 in the target, just to give you a trivial example. But you have to do this over then a relationship between the memories, so to speak, of the source program and of the target program. You set up a relation, you show that initially the relation holds, and then you say no matter how many steps I took, my source took and my target took, if I'm right here and the relation holds, then if the source takes one step, then the target takes one or more steps and things relate again using the same relation. So you come up with this relation to say how memories and program states, so to speak, in the source are related to these low-level program states in the target. And then you show that that relation is preserved as the two programs run. It's a simulation argument. And so this is easier to do if you're assuming a whole program. It becomes much harder if you assume, if you try to prove a stronger theorem about compiler correctness, which is that I am going to allow my target code to link with other things. So just to say what that looks like, this is one variation, it's not even the best one. Basically now I've written Eve because I want you to think of components, not whole programs. If I have a source component compiled to a target, I roughly want to show something like if you give me any, so basically I want to link that target code with some context to make it a whole program. Okay, so now we're back to trying to use contextual equivalence in a sort of way. So we say that if you have a target context that you want to link the target code with, then if you also have a source context that's equivalent to that somehow, so if CS and CT are equivalent, then that whole program, when run, its behavior matches the behavior of this target program, right? In essence. Of course, this is, yes, I see a hand going up. This is difficult because how do you know? How do you specify when CS and CT are related? Yeah.
So is that a relaxation of the previous notion? Because you say that they don't have to always be equivalent, but only within the contexts?
So this is saying for all possible contexts, CT, such that you have a related source context, CS. When you run the whole programs, they have to be related. I think of this, this is a generalization of the last one. It could be empty, in which case you get the last, the theorem on the last slide. But if your context is not empty, then you're doing something more powerful. You're saying, yes, I can handle linking. My compiler correctness theorem is, aware that this is how the compiler will be used in some sense.
So the idea is to say linking subroutine,
Yeah.
String comparing.
Yes.
I don't care about how string compare is implemented.
Uh-huh.
As long as it has a functionality.
Exactly. So I don't know, I don't care how it's implemented, as long as there's some CS that has the functionality of string compare, then composing this and composing that gives us the same behavior when run. UC compositionality, exactly, right? Yes, yes. This also has some issues because it assumes that anything that you're doing at the target must be representable or equivalent to something at the source. So there are all sorts of other issues then if you want to consider linking with code that could not be represented in your source language, but that's a PL problem maybe. Might not arise. This is hard to specify. It's not clear how to, it's again a sort of chicken and egg kind of problem. Normally we don't specify that equivalence directly for contexts. We do it using a different technique called logical relations, which is just a way of proving that things are equivalent. It goes back to that issue of, how do you compare two functions are equivalent? Well, if you give me two related inputs, then I get two related outputs, etc. Okay, so then there's this stronger property even, security preserving compilation or equivalence preserving compilation. And I wonder if this is UC, to be honest, which is part of why I wanted to show this. So now if you have two source components, ES1 and ES2, and they're indistinguishable by some attacker, let's say, by some context in the source, okay, so I compile them then, is the gray guy. Exactly. So if I have ES1 and ES2, they were indistinguishable by the gray thing in the source language. Gray things that can be written only in the source language, because we care about which language. Then after I've compiled them to ET1 and ET2, then they're indistinguishable by all possible contexts in the target. And now this is generally in PL, it's much harder to prove because at the target level, you have an assembly language. And in assembly language, attackers you can write in the assembly language or program context you can write in the assembly language can do a lot more things that are not possible in a source language. Like in assembly, you can jump anywhere and disrupt control flow, things that you cannot do in a well-behaved source language. So do we want, when we say UC preserving, one way of perhaps looking at that is to say, if I know that the ideal and real functionalities are equivalent at the source level, then when I compile, I want to know that the compiled real functionality is somehow equivalent to what? To the compiled ideal functionality? I'm not.
This doesn't strike me. This not immediately.
Okay.
The environment, we always talk about the red lines. We always talk about the worst possible,
yes.
the most powerful
distinguisher. So you always talk about the red context.
But it could be a way to go there, to prove like a DLI security in some sense, and rapid program that protects from the big in some way. But I don't know. But that's not what.
Okay. Well, I sort of have one other question. Maybe this is primarily a question for Ron, but because it's about UC. So the assumption about the yes, the assumption about the attacker in UC. When you write your real protocol at such a high level of abstraction, from a PL perspective, it's still in a high level source language, the wild language, an EasyCrypt, for instance. I guess you talk about your attacker as, this is a polynomial time, etc. I've been wondering if the powers of the attacker go up when we are in a low-level language. Have you thought about that? Is there? For example, how do you handle attacks, or low-level attacks?
whereas we mostly talk about, programmatic attacks like sending messages or reordering messages.
Okay, so then as we compile, we want to take additional attacks into account, which means that if we want to take protocols verified at the source level and run their compiled implementations eventually, we should be taking these additional, or no?
I think it's still a sufficient goal just to have like a way of taking a high level specification and being certain that at least the low level thing is equivalent and therefore immune to all of those programmatic level attacks. I don't think you have to get the whole kitchen sink and
Oh, sure,
all
sure,
attacks.
sure. But I was wondering, do you think that there are vulnerabilities in the long term? Yeah.
First, there's an issue here, it's a fundamental issue with the UC modeling, but it's actually more like the way it's used today. And this is the way that there really is a big discrepancy here between the UC is written like in a very low level language, kind of Turing machines or whatever other machines you want to say. It's not even written in a, in a PL formal enough language, written in English, in broken English, but
A major part of the gap.
exactly. And even if one did write a completely formal PL style modeling of the way that you see the way it's written now, my work and other people's work that have different variants of this, it is very, very low level and kind of like assembly style level. And then the programs are written in some high level language and then there is some hand waving going on, so it's okay. And there's a lot of issues there, right?
So what are they? I want the.
So we never know. So we always believe that our proofs are like essentially okay. One just need to fill out details, and maybe 90% of the time it's okay. Sometimes it's not. But really, if one wanted to do this thing, like really, one would have to actually specify a programming language and actually write the ideal functionalities and the protocols in this programming language proof. And this is one thing that Ali did. That for this very simple thing in this, and this programming language of EasyCrypt, which doesn't even have a compiler, but never mind, at least it's a programming language, and this is maybe a first start, and so one really needs to do that, and actually that I want to slightly take back what I said earlier about the the blue and the red. So I think actually the UC modeling does have an equivalent for that, which is this notion of ideal functionalities that give you kind of like an abstraction of reality. So there's this ideal functionality that give you secure communication or authenticated communication. So this kind of restricts, in some sense, the environment of the attacker, the gray area, from specific attacks because the parties know that in the design of the protocol they have ideal authenticated communication. Or you can say one specific type of abstraction is saying that the way you write the code of the protocol, you write the code such that in a single run of in a single activation of your program, you do that many pieces of code, and then nobody can measure how much time it really took because in the model it's one kind of quantum of execution. And that's already, by the way you write it this way, you can say there is no timing attack of what's happened inside because nobody measures. And if you wanted to actually allow the adversary access to that, you would have to do something. Either leak to the adversary something about the number of steps, or maybe write the atomic step is something smaller, or something. You have to actually model it. So there is a way in the UC to actually make, to kind of like tie the hands of the environment from, say, to blue to the red. It's not as explicit, but it's there. Maybe it's a good thing to make it explicit.
Yeah. So actually, that's kind of what I wanted to say. How do we make it explicit? Well, I left it at that.
Yeah. So I mean, this kind of contextual equivalence is symmetric, right? I mean, that's one of the things. It's transitive, it's reflexive, it's symmetric, it's an equivalence, and it works in context. And if we think about UC, then there's transitivity and there's reflexivity, but there is certainly not symmetry, right? It doesn't even make sense to talk.
So this we can always do contextual approximations.
Right, but I don't think that that's the issue. That, I mean, the issue is that there's a fundamental asymmetry, that on the left side you have real plus adversary, on the right side you have ideal plus simulator wrapped around adversary, and so that's one thing, that you can't just flip it around. It doesn't make sense in that direction. The other thing is that what the context in PL terms has like two different analogs in UC. That the environment is a kind of context because it's supplying inputs to the functionality and consuming their outputs. The kind of normal API is flowing back and forth that way. And so, which contexts, right, are like that as well in like a functional language, even in PL. But the adversary is a different kind of context. It's observing sort of other behavior that the like network traffic of the parties of the real functionality. There's also this issue of it being able to corrupt certain parts of the real functionality that, you know, that are marked as corruptible, which, you know, that's another dimension to this. But even if we don't think about that, they're like these two different aspects of the context that have these two different places within UC. And I mean, so that's something I think, I mean, I really feel like there's something fundamentally different. And I feel like in the PL community that we should try to figure out what to do with this more generally. And if I can, I mean, sorry, can I just talk for a couple more minutes? That I came, you know, I came from PL to Lincoln Lab and found myself doing stuff with EasyCrypt and learning about the real ideal paradigm. And I thought, oh wow, this is really, really different from anything I'd ever seen before. And I ended up writing, among other things, a paper with some colleagues about how to think about the security of Battleship in a totally programming language context. There was no crypto as we were doing this. All the enforcement was by programming language mechanisms. But I found, I mean, we had some implementations using like information flow languages that some interns had written. And when I thought, well, what does it mean to be secure, right? What does it mean to be secure for one player to be secure against another one that might be bad, you know, in their interactions? When I started out, I thought, well, I have no idea. And in the end, I realized, well, real ideal was the way to think about this, because what happens in Battleship is that information is really slowly revealed to you over time. But in the end, you learn everything. And you can give an ideal functionality for that, so that when you think about how you might want to implement it, you might use a programming language that has information flow control or some other technique, but at least you have a definition that you're trying to match. And I think within the PL security, the language-based security community, I've been trying to make the point that often there is no definition, you know, that people are trying to prove. What does security mean? No one knows. That, you know, they know it when they see it. And the great thing that crypto has come up with Real Ideal is a way of saying that and separating that from an actual implementation. So I think this, you know, that there's something actually new, and things like, you know, how does this manifest itself more generally within programming languages? I'm not sure that, you know, we can make sense of it in terms of security, but I want to say that there's got to be some reading of all of this that's broader than that.
So the question that I had was kind of in response to Amal's question. So why not try to see we have ideal yeah, ideal and real. And then you say we want to compile the real implementation into a lower level. So why not to put it to the left, the implementation level, put it to the left of the real one, and call the real now the new ideal, and the implementation the new real.
Right, so
You
sorry,
can have a chain as long as you wish.
yes, so let's do this maybe downwards. So there's ideal at the top, the real implements it, or emulates it, and then the compiled version of the real emulates the original version of the real, right? As a stack. Yes, this was another way I was trying to depict it to someone yesterday. But I still don't really know what, maybe that is the correct theorem that we want. I've been sort of asking this question of,
And you could use the same
what do we?
terminology, the same definition.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That would apply. Yeah. So it's a question of what theorem are we looking for in terms of how we use these protocols at the end of the day, the compiled versions. That's what I wanted to do with this discussion. Like, can we start thinking about those?
When you compose these layers,
yes,
then you don't violate any surprising composability.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
I have a question. In general, I mean, when we talk about crypto simulation security, it offers both correctness and privacy. Now, let's leave privacy for a minute and just ask about correctness. The program that I'm writing, is it indeed sorting numbers, or is it computing FFT of something? Now, how does one prove this, let's say in the PL world, saying some piece of code actually does the computation that I care about? Because simulation gives both. It both tells that the protocol I'm emulating does compute the intended functionality as well as privacy. And I'm asking just in terms of
the correctness
property.
So you write down a specification for what you for what functionality you want, the full functional spec, so to speak, and then you show that the thing that you have implemented actually satisfies that specification. And you can do this in COC, for instance. And that's what people have been doing for a while now with all the verified software that they're building.
Say maybe suggest that I think Ali's point and your view, there's one way to kind of merge them. So maybe what we're doing in crypto, but the ideal real paradigm is that the specification is by itself a program. And it's a program that nobody ever wants to run, nobody thinks of running, just a convenient way, maybe conceptually convenient way to run the specification, which combines security and secrecy, correctness, etc. Because we're talking about distributed thing, there's this trusted party, whatever we all know. So it's a program for a trusted party, and this is our specification. And from now on, well, first it's conceptually convenient because we know what we want, even in a distributed system. And then from now on, we can just deploy the same techniques, right? And then this refinement on compilation techniques.
And so there's one.
Except that this first program is something we never want to actually run.
Yes.
Never actually run.
This happens in concurrency. So in PL, when we verify like fine-grained concurrent data structures, how do we do it? We write down a specification for it, but the specification is just a sequential program. It's just a simple way of writing a program that says, yes, this is what I want at the end of the day. It's the sequential program that implements that. So we view that as a spec, exactly like you're saying. Yeah.
But then Andrew yesterday was not very happy with it. He said there, there are things that you don't even know what
Yeah.
it means. But that's a different question.
That's,
you can put things on that.
yeah.
So I just had a confusion or a question about what Ali was saying. So you were making a distinction between the environment choosing the inputs and consuming the outputs, and then the adversary doing whatever it does to the participants. But I guess I would argue that the environment and the adversary are the same thing, and it's all one interface, and that interface is always well defined as the functionality. So whether it's the environment choosing the inputs or the adversary, talking to the functionality or taking control over a party, it's all arbitrary behavior that this context can do. And I don't think that I didn't understand the distinction between those two. And actually, I would argue that the thing that makes this complicated is that we want to prove a statement that says there exists a simulator. I think once you have the simulator, you're just talking about some contextual equivalence of two programs. It's the composition of all these things in the real world and a composition of some other things in the ideal world, and they should be equivalent in an arbitrary context.
The context can be a composition of the simulator and the environment.
Well, the two composed programs are equivalent, and one of the composed programs contains a simulator. If you're starting out and you don't have the simulator, then asking EasyCrypt to find the simulator is challenging, but I would suspect that once the human cryptographer wrote down the simulator, then you just have like two well-defined programs that need to be contextually equivalent in arbitrary contexts.
Well, yeah, I'm not, I mean, I tried to say that I thought that the environment and the adversary were two different aspects of what we might think of as the context, but they have different roles, right? One of them is about input-output behavior, and the other is about other things that can be observed. So like network traffic or other kind of side effects and things. And the way that the simulator fits into this, this real ideal pair of games just seems quite, and nestles in with the ideal functionality, seems really different to me from just application of a context as we see in PL. So I'm not, I mean, I'm trying to argue that that the context has been split kind of into these two different places, and when you put together multiple stages transitivity wise, and you see then the simulators are stacking up one on top of the other, and that's just, I mean, it's like two-dimensional rather than one-dimensional or something, that we've got these two, and it doesn't, the fact that the adversary and the environment are working in concert doesn't change that. It's still a more complicated kind of topology.
So maybe I was afraid that, so I think you're looking like maybe the vertical part of the environment is the adversary, but really, as you said, the point is that there's a difference between the API, and the side effects, and that's where it's.
Yeah.
And then we would start.
Yes.
With it, yeah.
And when we put multiple levels of this together, I mean, I think it's useful to sort of visualize how the simulators end up nesting.
Yeah.
So it's, this is fundamentally two-dimensional. I mean, even the way you draw it is two-dimensional, where you can kind of see a context as one-dimensional.
Yeah. And the kind of the API versus the side effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it feels like, I mean, if we run with this idea, I mean, well, in PL we have side effects, which are not quite like this, but but I feel like there's got to be a way of reading this that would be really useful in PL. I just don't know. I mean, in terms of language-based security, it's clearly useful, but I feel like it's useful more globally. And like it's different. It's just different from anything I'd seen before.
Yeah, the way I've been looking at it is, how can we connect these ideas with an end in mind? And to me, the end in mind is sort of end-to-end security of the things that we run. I want to swap. I want to encourage all of you to think about what are all of the assumptions that we make when we prove certain things, right? About a protocol at a certain level, and what's the gap between that and the thing that actually runs, and how can we sort of start to formally model what those gaps are, and then perhaps start to fill them. That was the angle I was sort of taking going into this. I have one other big topic that I was hoping we can discuss. So this is this idea of, there are a lot of different languages, libraries out there to make it easier for people to implement multi-party computation and applications and so on. And I sort of split this up into two columns, and I'm To be honest, sometimes I'm not quite sure what to put where. Like you can see I put obliv-C and obliv-VM in both columns. So languages that make it easier to write crypto primitives or MPC primitives, right? And that is this column. And then there are various languages, DSLs like Wisteria, or there's ShareMind, how that make it easier to write applications. The question I sort of wanted to open up to the floor is, what is missing in this space? What is still hard? What do we not know how to do? Do we need better abstractions, and if so, for what? What in your experience are the things that we're missing? Or the other thing is, from a PL sort of perspective, we PL people keep trying to understand, like trying to design DSLs, perhaps languages with stronger type systems, so that the type checking can give you certain guarantees about the protocol you're implementing, for instance, or the multi-party computation you're implementing. So Wisteria had that goal in mind. Then there's this WIS-star work, which has an even stronger dependent type system where you can verify everything you're writing. So what are the sweet spots? What could we design? What are the guarantees or assurances we're looking for, from lightweight to heavier?
So I'll just, this kind of touches on the resource estimation part I was talking about earlier, that I'm going to write a program and I want it to do the fastest crypto thing that's secure, whatever, or most resource efficient, whatever that means. And I don't know how to link between, oh yeah, we've designed all these special purpose things. These are the guarantees that they provide for this. Are they compatible, right? I don't know how to
Performance guarantees.
I don't have performance or security guarantees when I'm switching between primitives.
Okay. Switching between primitives, not composing primitives. Both. Yeah. You need specs for that, and then you need these things to be composable. Yeah.
Maybe one thing to do is when you write a compiler from one language to another, somehow, and you want to write, what is the kind of the ideal functionality of this compiler, that it would preserve correctness, obviously, and then it will also do something with respect to side channel leakage, in terms of I have guarantees that if the code has some specific high-level language, side channel protection, I'll be able to implement them correctly in the low-level language. But then it will have to kind of depend on whatever guarantees that the hardware is giving, to the low-level language. But somehow one has to build this all the way up from the hardware. Maybe one should start from the hardware. This is the guarantees that I'm giving, with respect to side channel attacks, with respect to cache attacks, and whatever in terms of timing. And maybe there is, there's all this discussion today about reopening the hardware-software contract. So maybe one can actually add to this contract some bits that the program can tell the hardware, am I, do I want to be secure? Do I not want to be secure? Should you do cache optimizations or not? Or can you, and then pay maybe for performance, and then give some guarantees that part to the contract will be the what leakage I'm giving, and this will propagate all the way up, and then anyway, that will be one way to do it.
So even there, I feel like there are two ways people have looked at this. One is to sort of say, in the PL community, like how do we give a high-level language a cost semantics? How does some idealized kind of cost semantics at the high level map to, more precise costs at the low level, but in a uniform way, right? In a faithful sort of way. Then there's this other idea. I don't know if fiat crypto is quite the perfect thing to point at for this, but fiat crypto is this, Adam Chappell has been working on this, right? Write down specs and then generate performant implementations, the most performant that you can, which of course then requires some sort of specification at the hardware level or at a lower level, like, what sort of performance guarantees are we getting? Like, what are the resource costs at the lower level?
Not just performance, also leakage costs.
Yes, also leakage costs. Exactly. Yes. Leakage guarantees, especially then we need to know from the hardware, like what's happening. But yeah.
So if we think about what if we think about what the environment does at different levels, then it might be that at a higher level, there are like more abstract values that are flowing back and forth between the environment and a real or ideal functionality. The adversary, though, at a lower level might be seeing things that don't even make sense at a higher level of abstraction. So they might be seeing, I don't know, cache behavior or, some kind of low-level stuff that is a side effect of the functionalities running. That at a higher level, how do you make sense of these things? I mean, I have.
You want to hide it from
Yeah.
the programmer, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it quite makes sense to think at the highest level, you've got these pure programming notations and trying to imagine all of the mischief that can happen at a lower level. You don't want to do it there. But if we're thinking about moving from a UC theorem at a high level to eventually a UC theorem at the low level, where there's all this more stuff that can happen, it seems like maybe you need to do some extra work at those lower levels to convince yourself that, I mean, you don't want to say the adversary has exactly the same discriminating power down there. You want to say, well, we need to think about adversaries that are more able to see all this stuff that's going on, and so there's going to be something going on in that path that we'll have to do. I mean, we'll have to actually do those proofs. Sorry.
So when you say that, are you talking about the adversary seeing properties of the actual compiled code that are only evident at the low level, or are you talking about the adversary being able to control the machine hardware at that lower level? Because I think if like timing properties and so on, those could be mitigated at the compiler level by the compiler providing guarantees saying, I will do everything I can to reduce the possibility of timing, different paths through this same functionality having different times for cases where you explicitly ask for it. But there are, if the problem of the adversary having low-level control of the hardware, not necessarily in its interaction with your code, but in its interaction with other things, that's a lot harder to solve.
Yeah, I think the second problem is just even more hard, that there are more things. So if the adversary can corrupt certain things, then there are more things that might be corruptible at a lower level. But even if we just think about it being able to observe the sort of side effects, then yeah, we have to find a way to mitigate that. And I mean, one way is that as we compile to lower and lower levels, that we somehow shield things or do it, in constant time or, whatever, so that even when more things are exposed at the lower level, it doesn't help the adversary, that it can't manage to see anything new. Something like that. I mean, I guess we had in discussions in the back of the room earlier today, at a higher level, you might have an authenticated channel. At a lower level, you might actually need to use like signatures and things to, and some crypto to make something work that at a higher level you just had for free. And so, I mean, as we go down the stack, then how things are enforced may change. I don't know.
So if there's something at the lower level that you're considering shielding or making it so the programmer doesn't have to be aware of that, that's really another way of saying, I want my compiling toolchain to provide guarantees of that.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, one aspect of that is how the compiler works, but then as we take abstract facilities and turn them into concrete realizations, then we may need to use different enforcement mechanisms. That at an abstract level, we might just have something in the programming language that we know works, right? That it's abstract, and when we realize that with nuts and bolts at a lower level, then maybe we have to introduce some crypto to convince ourselves that, you know, to be able to prove that it still works, that it hasn't broken at that level. I know.
And this kind of work is happening in the area of secure compilation, though there, you know, it's not crypto, or it's not UC preservation, it's sort of a equivalence preservation in the presence of all contexts kind of property. So there are sort of two camps. You can, you know, a lot of my work has been about how do you compile down to lower and lower levels, in a sense taking a high level spec, I do it using types, but essentially some sort of specification of the program, but then as you compile lower and lower down, you say you want to tighten that spec in a sense. So the specification to me is saying what context am I allowed to link with? What attackers am I allowed to link with? So you somehow want to rule out linking with contexts that would behave badly. Another thing you could do is you could wrap your code, or you know, your protocol in this case, with some sort of dynamic checks, and that would be, you know, using some sort of crypto perhaps to protect it from the additional attacks that are now possible at a lower level that never could have arisen at the high level.
So how would you do in your language? How would you specify the compiler protects against timing attacks, even if the program is susceptible to timing attacks? The result of the code is not. How would you specify?
We don't know how to do timing yet, right? We like haven't even tried it. It's too, yeah.
Sometimes I think this kind of like real ideal way is saying that don't give leakage to the adversary.
Yes. Yeah.
About the timing. So
Yes.
even if what the program was,
You could do this if you're. Yeah, you could do this if you could somehow ask that the adversary that you're going to link with satisfy a certain specification. The specification is very precise about timing somehow, about what timing behavior that adversary is that context you're linking with is allowed to observe. That's a very low level difficult spec, but yes, that general idea, yeah.
Yeah, I actually don't. So you can, I mean, the notion of program behavior can certainly include timing behavior, and that just makes the kind of thing that Amal was showing us harder, that you know, if you have two contextually equivalent programs at a high level, and then at the low level, at a high level where timing, you know, whatever behavior doesn't mean anything, maybe, and then
at
it'll.
a high level, let's say you assume, given your language model, that timing is not observable, but now
Yeah,
suddenly at the low
yeah,
level it is.
that's
So how
right,
do you-
and
they're
so
observable.
so that means that the compiler somehow is going to have to deal with that, which is kind of what Patrick's point was, and I think that's not something where that's not a fundamental point of difference between this PL kind of style contextual development and real ideal. I think. I mean, I think it's an issue in both.
you could model it with real ideal, right? But,
yes, I mean it also comes up in real ideal, but there's some things just seem like they're points of difference, and some of them are points of commonality. This seems like a point of commonality. So the split between the ideal functionality in the simulator, you know, and the asymmetry that's there, it seems like something that's different, but other things seem like they're similar to me.
Abhi, do you want to say something about obliv-C? Or, oh yeah, we have a couple minutes. Okay. Anyone else want to add anything? No? Okay, then thank you very much to the organizers for organizing this entire two-day workshop, and let's give them a hand. Thank you all for staying till the end. We lost a few.
Maya and Rebecca in particular, we should.
Yes.